September 24, 1942. The conference room at Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia was suffocating with tension. Around the massive oak table sat the highest-ranking officers of the German Wehrmacht, their uniforms immaculate, their expressions carefully blank. At the head sat Adolf Hitler. And standing before him, delivering a briefing that would end his career, was General Franz Halder, chief of the German General Staff. Halder had held this position since 1938, through the triumphs in Poland, France, and the Low Countries. He'd helped architect the invasions that made Germany master of continental Europe. But now in the autumn of 1942, he was about to commit an unforgivable sin in Nazi Germany. He was about to tell Hitler the truth. The subject was Stalingrad. For 2 months, the Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus had been fighting block by block, building by building through the Soviet industrial city on the Volga River. Progress measured in meters, casualties mounting catastrophically. And Halder had done the mathematics. What followed would become one of the most telling moments of World War II. Not a battle won or lost, but a conversation that sealed the fate of 280,000 men and revealed the fatal flaw at the heart of Nazi Germany's war machine. When leaders punish truth-tellers, truth becomes extinct, and when truth dies, armies follow. Halder began with facts. The Sixth Army had suffered over 80,000 casualties since August. Soviet reinforcements were streaming across the Volga every night. German supply lines stretched dangerously thin, running hundreds of kilometers across open steppe that Soviet partisans increasingly disrupted. Winter was approaching. The army wasn't prepared for it. Then Halder spoke the words that would destroy him. "Mein Führer, we cannot capture Stalingrad with available forces. The cost in men and materiel will exceed any strategic benefit. I recommend we consolidate positions, prepare winter defenses, and resume offensive operations in spring when properly supplied and reinforced." The silence that followed was absolute. Every officer in that room understood what Halder had just done. He had contradicted Hitler. He had suggested withdrawal. He had implied the Führer's strategy was wrong. These were career-ending statements, possibly life-ending statements. Hitler's face flushed crimson. His voice, when it came, was quiet at first, which was always more dangerous than his screaming. "You recommend withdrawal?" A pause. "You, who have overseen every retreat and setback of this campaign, you, who have constantly counseled caution and hesitation while I have delivered victory after victory." Halder stood his ground. This was the moment that would define him. He could retreat, apologize, soften his statements. Or he could speak the complete truth, knowing it would finish his military career. He chose truth. "Mein Führer, I have studied the logistics carefully. The Sixth Army requires approximately 700 tons of supplies daily. We can deliver perhaps 300 tons on favorable days. As winter approaches, this will decrease further. The Soviet forces in Stalingrad are not collapsing. Intelligence indicates they're preparing a major counter-offensive, likely targeting our flanks, held by Romanian and Italian forces with inadequate anti-tank weapons. If we continue concentrating forces in Stalingrad itself, we risk encirclement of the entire Sixth Army." The specificity of Halder's assessment made it worse, not better. He wasn't offering vague concerns. He was presenting detailed analysis that directly contradicted Hitler's vision of inevitable victory. He was using facts and logistics against ideology and willpower. Hitler stood. The rage was no longer controlled. "You dare tell me what is possible and impossible? I, who have achieved what every expert claimed was impossible? I, who conquered France in 6 weeks when your precious General Staff said it would take years? I, who have brought Germany from defeat to mastery of Europe?" Halder tried to respond. "Mein Führer, I'm not questioning your achievements. I'm presenting the mathematical reality." "Mathematics," Hitler shouted. "Always you speak of mathematics and logistics and caution. Wars are won by will, by determination, by refusing to accept defeat. The Bolsheviks stand on the verge of collapse. Stalingrad is the key. Once it falls, the entire Soviet position on the Volga collapses. We will control the river. We will control access to Caucasus oil. We will win this war. But at what cost? Halder asked, his voice rising despite himself. Even if we capture Stalingrad, which will require at least another month of this grinding urban combat, we'll have an exhausted army holding an exposed position deep in Soviet territory with winter approaching and supply lines that cannot possibly sustain. Enough! Hitler's hands slammed on the table. I am surrounded by pessimists and defeatists, by men who see obstacles instead of opportunities, by generals who want to retreat at the first sign of resistance. You, Halder, have been a brake on this army's potential since the beginning. You opposed the attack on France. You opposed the invasion of the Soviet Union. You have opposed every bold stroke that led to German victory. And now you oppose Stalingrad. The accusation was partially accurate. Halder had indeed expressed concerns about many of Hitler's decisions, but he'd also helped execute them, often brilliantly. The problem was that Hitler only remembered the objections, not the successes. And in Hitler's mind, anyone who questioned him was by definition wrong, because he was never wrong. Other officers in the room shifted uncomfortably. Some agreed with Halder's assessment. Field commanders from the Eastern Front had been sending similar reports about overstretched supply lines and exhausted troops. But none would speak up. They'd learned that agreeing with criticism of Hitler's strategy was career suicide. Halder made one final attempt. Mein Führer, I have served Germany faithfully. You have served your own timidity. You have served your outdated general staff thinking. You have not served the vision that Germany requires. I need generals who believe in victory, not accountants who count costs. Hitler turned to Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, his most loyal subordinate. Halder is relieved of command as Chief of the General Staff, effective immediately. He will be replaced by General Kurt Zeitzler. Perhaps a younger officer with Eastern Front experience will have the aggressive spirit this position requires. Halder removed the insignia from his collar and placed them on the table. He'd known this was coming the moment he decided to speak honestly. He gave a formal salute and left the room. His military career was over. He would spend the rest of the war in forced retirement, eventually arrested after the July 1944 plot to assassinate Hitler, though he wasn't directly involved. But as he walked out, Halder knew he'd been right. Every calculation he'd made, every concern he'd voiced was accurate. And in the next 4 months, he would be proven horrifically correct. November the 19th, 1942, exactly 8 weeks later, the counteroffensive Halder predicted was launched. Soviet forces struck the Romanian positions north and south of Stalingrad, precisely as Halder had warned. The Romanians, with inadequate anti-tank weapons and thin defenses, collapsed within hours. By November 23rd, the entire German Sixth Army was encircled. Over 280,000 men trapped in the city Hitler had insisted must be taken at all costs. The supply crisis Halder had calculated with precision materialized exactly as he'd predicted. The Luftwaffe attempted to supply the pocket by air, but never approached the required 700 tons daily. Most days they delivered 100 tons or less. Soldiers starved, equipment failed from lack of fuel and parts, medical supplies vanished, men froze to death in inadequate winter quarters. The Sixth Army commanders, trapped in the pocket, sent desperate messages requesting permission to break out while it was still possible. Hitler refused. Remembering Halder's advice about withdrawal and determined to prove that willpower could overcome logistics, the army would hold Stalingrad. Relief forces would break through. The situation would be restored through determination and fighting spirit. But determination doesn't create food where there is none. Willpower doesn't generate ammunition. Fighting spirit doesn't warm frozen soldiers or heal wounded men without medical supplies. The mathematics Halder presented proved inexorable. By December, the Sixth Army was combat ineffective. By January, soldiers were dying of starvation. By February 2nd, 1943, the survivors surrendered. Of the 280,000 men trapped, approximately 91,000 survived to surrender. Most would die in Soviet captivity. Only about 6,000 ever returned to Germany. Halder watched all of this from forced retirement. He kept detailed diaries that would later become important historical documents. In them, he recorded his frustration at being right while being treated as wrong. He documented the precise ways his predictions materialized. And he reflected on the fundamental problem that had destroyed him and would ultimately destroy Germany. The problem was that Hitler had created a system where truth was whatever he decided it was. Facts that contradicted his vision were dismissed as defeatism. Officers who presented accurate assessments were accused of lacking fighting spirit. The entire military command structure had been corrupted by the need to tell Hitler what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to know. Halder had tried to be the exception. He'd tried to maintain professional military standards of honest assessment and realistic planning. But in Hitler's Germany, professional competence was subordinate to ideological loyalty. Better to be wrong and loyal than right and critical. The yes men survived while the truth-tellers were purged. General Kurt Zeitzler, who replaced Halder, was initially more aggressive and optimistic, which Hitler appreciated. But within months, Zeitzler too was presenting the same concerns about Stalingrad that Halder had voiced. The difference was that by then, the army was already trapped. Zeitzler's belated honesty came too late to prevent disaster, only to document it. Hitler's response to Zeitzler was identical to his response to Halder: dismissal of concerns, accusations of defeatism, and insistence that willpower would prevail. Zeitzler lasted longer than Halder, but eventually he too was dismissed after repeatedly requesting permission for retreats that might have saved German forces. He suffered a nervous breakdown in 1944 and was removed from command. The pattern repeated throughout the war. Competent generals who told Hitler the truth were fired. Sycophants who told him what he wanted to hear were promoted. And German military operations became increasingly divorced from strategic reality. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, perhaps Germany's most capable general, managed the delicate balance better than most. He would present realistic assessments, but frame them in ways that didn't directly contradict Hitler. He would request flexible defense rather than retreat. He would emphasize strategic repositioning rather than withdrawal. This semantic game sometimes worked, but it also meant that even Germany's best military minds were spending energy managing Hitler's ego rather than fighting the war. The tragedy of Halder's firing wasn't just that Germany lost a capable staff officer. It was that the incident sent a clear message throughout the Wehrmacht: telling the Führer the truth is more dangerous than losing battles. This created an atmosphere where officers at all levels learned to distort or suppress information that might anger Hitler. Intelligence reports were softened, casualty figures were minimized, enemy strength was underestimated, supply problems were downplayed. This systematic distortion of information flowed upward through the command structure, meaning Hitler's decisions were based on increasingly fictional assessments of reality. He was making strategic choices based on what his subordinates thought he wanted to hear, rather than what was actually happening. This information gap widened throughout the war, contributing to catastrophically poor decisions in 1943, 1944, and 1945. The Battle of Stalingrad became the symbol of this dysfunction. Hitler had insisted the city could be taken because he needed it taken for political and psychological reasons. Halder had said it couldn't be taken, or at least not at acceptable cost, because the logistics didn't support it. Halder was fired for this assessment. And then reality proved Halder correct in the most catastrophic way possible. But even after Stalingrad, Hitler didn't learn the lesson. He didn't recognize that firing advisors for telling the truth was counterproductive. Instead, he doubled down. The defeats must have been caused by incompetent or treasonous generals. The solution was to exert more personal control, to rely even less on professional military advice, to trust his intuition over expert analysis. This pattern continued to the war's end. In 1944, when Allied forces landed in Normandy, Hitler refused to release panzer reserves because he was convinced the landing was a feint and the real invasion would come at Calais. His generals knew better, but had learned not to contradict him too forcefully. By the time Hitler accepted that Normandy was the main invasion, it was too late to effectively counterattack. In 1945, as Soviet forces approached Berlin, Hitler was still moving phantom divisions on maps, issuing orders to armies that no longer existed, planning counteroffensives with resources that had been destroyed months earlier. His staff knew the situation was hopeless, but continued executing meaningless orders because they'd learned that truth-telling was punished, while obedient failure was merely unfortunate. Halder survived the war. He was arrested by the Americans, then used as a consultant for historical research about German military operations. He provided detailed testimony about the dysfunctional relationship between Hitler and the general staff. He explained how professional military planning had been subordinated to ideological fantasy. He documented the precise ways Hitler's refusal to accept reality had led to strategic disasters. In his later writings, Halder reflected on his firing with mixed feelings. On one hand, being proven right was cold comfort when hundreds of thousands of men died unnecessarily. On the other hand, he'd maintained his professional integrity when it would have been easier and safer to go along with delusion. He'd told the truth when truth-telling was dangerous, and he'd paid the price for it. The lesson of Halder's firing extends beyond military history. It's a case study in what happens when institutions prioritize loyalty over competence, when criticism is treated as betrayal, when leaders surround themselves with yes-men rather than experts willing to deliver bad news. The pattern is recognizable across history and across different types of organizations. Leaders who punish truth-tellers create systems where truth becomes increasingly rare. Subordinates learn to tell leaders what they want to hear rather than what they need to know. Decisions get made based on comfortable fictions rather than uncomfortable facts. And eventually, reality asserts itself in catastrophic ways that could have been avoided if someone had been willing to listen to the holders of the world. September the 24th, 1942, was the day Hitler fired his best general for telling the truth about Stalingrad. It was also the day Hitler guaranteed that Stalingrad would become the catastrophe Halder had predicted, because by removing the one advisor willing to speak honestly, Hitler ensured that no one else would try. The truth about Stalingrad became unspeakable. And an unspeakable truth led to an unspeakable tragedy. Franz Halder lived until 1972, long enough to see Germany rebuilt, to see the Wehrmacht's reputation partially rehabilitated, and to see historians recognize that he'd been right about Stalingrad. But he also lived long enough to know that being right had mattered less than being believed, and that telling the truth had cost him everything, while lying had cost Germany far more. The firing of Franz Halder wasn't just a personnel decision. It was a choice between reality and fantasy, between professional competence and ideological purity, between honest assessment and comfortable delusion. Hitler chose wrong. And 280,000 men at Stalingrad paid the price for that choice. The general who told the truth was silenced. The truth he spoke became reality. And an empire that refused to hear the truth collapsed under the weight of its own delusions.